Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for being with us today. Drug-related prison rule violations doubled in Ohio from 2020 to 2024. It's a problem that leaders say is representative of the greater communities we all live in, but the outside world isn't subject to the same controls that incarcerated people are supposed to be. A year-long investigation by journalists with the Marshall Project Cleveland and the Columbus Dispatch revealed a scary reality: the extent to which Ohio prison officials are failing to stop drugs being smuggled inside, and that those drugs are leading to the death of incarcerated persons. Today, we'll hear from those journalists and some of their interviewees, including people who are currently serving sentences for their roles in Ohio's prison drug trade. With us in studio today is Marshall Project Cleveland staff writer Doug Livingston. Doug, thanks for being with us.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Joining us by phone, we have Laura Bischoff, Ohio politics and state government reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. Hi, Laura.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Thanks for being with us today. Also by phone, we have Dr. Alex Krotulski, Director of Toxicology and Chemistry with the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education. Thanks for being with us, Alex.
Good morning.
Now, if you have questions or comments for our panel, maybe you have a story you want to share about a loved one incarcerated or suffering from drug addiction, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org or message us on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. As we kick this off, Laura, I'd like to know what led to this investigation.
Well, it's not surprising that there are drugs in prisons, but Doug and I were talking about kind of the extent and why this is happening. And as we, delved into this, we were really pretty surprised by the scope and the entrenchment of the problem.
Doug, how did it come up for you? What led to actually asking the questions and knocking on the doors?
Sure. So last year I was reporting on restrictions that were placed on receiving legal mail. Attorneys were sending confidential letters to their incarcerated clients, and they were being opened by the system, read and scanned, and then I kind of worked backwards. Why is this happening? The system was saying that drugs were being sprayed onto paper, and this was being one way of getting it into the prisons. And so during the pandemic, when visitation was shut down, the drugs were still flowing into the prisons. Well, they've since stopped all paper mail from coming in. Everything is scanned. And every story that I was hearing from incarcerated people I was talking to about other stories always took me to the violence and drugs inside prisons. And when we looked at the data on the percent of cases that were drugs found through the mail system, coming through the mailroom, it was such a tiny fraction, about 3%. Over the last 4 or 5 years. And so where is this stuff coming in? Why can't we stop it from coming in places that are literally locked down, under surveillance 24/7?
Okay. Now, Doug, for your report, you talked with the former director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, Annette Chambers Smith, and I say former, she just resigned on Saturday, just a couple of days ago. Now, reporting has suggested that resignation might be tied to lack of safety for people who are incarcerated and also prison workers. And this was following the 2024 killing of Ross Correctional Institution officer Andrew Lansing. So I'll ask you, do you have any insight into why Chambers Smith resigned?
No, I think she's worked under Governor DeWine since he took office. This is the last year of his administration. His second term is ending. She's taken a position in the governor's office to work on some criminal justice issues. I don't see a direct link to the death of Correction Officer Andrew Lansing on Christmas Day 2024. It's been well over a year since that happened. So if you think there would have been some blowback, that would have happened a little bit earlier.
And we do know that Chambers Smith is working in DeWine's office now.
Yes, that's what she's told us.
Okay. So there's an interview with Chambers Smith from your reporting. So she's talking about drugs used inside the prison walls. Let's hear that now.
We should stop thinking about the prison as somewhere other and it's special. I mean, I just went to get my hair done the other day and there was a lady overdosing across the street. So we see it in the community, we see it in our community, which is inside the prison. Some of the drugs are things like floor wax that's been scraped up, or when the exterminator comes, people will lay paper down on the product the exterminator spreads and then cut that up and sell it and smoke it. So the staff started saying, okay, we're not letting anybody in until this dries. So then the incarcerated people wet it down and kept doing it. One of the biggest misconceptions, I think, is that we're looking for recognizable drugs as they'd be recognizable in the streets. We're looking a lot of times for paper that's been adulterated. How much do you think this piece of paper is worth? Let's say the average is $6,000, right? An M is enough to get you high. And there's 1,500 M's on a sheet of paper.
And for our Sound of Ideas audience who is listening on the radio as opposed to watching on ohiochannel.org or on the IdeaStream Public Media YouTube page, Chambers Smith was holding up an 8.5 by 11 piece of printer paper there, and it had a capital letter M printed repeatedly, line by line, on that paper. And that's what she's talking about is enough to get a person high. A space that big, just a tiny little confetti-sized slice of paper once it's been adulterated. Now, Alex, you've studied prison drug overdose deaths extensively. What have you found most deadly for inmates?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is, like many other drug supplies, the drugs that we're seeing in prisons are extremely potent. These synthetic cannabinoids can be hundreds of times more potent than Delta-9 THC, the active component in cannabis. So very small amounts of these substances can be sprayed onto papers, as was previously mentioned, and it only takes a little bit of those to get high. But the problem becomes, in terms of adverse effects and deaths, is that there's, because these drugs are so potent, there's a very low threshold for these erratic behaviors, these sort of bad side effects, which can lead to death, which obviously we've now been seeing increasing, not only in Ohio, but in other states as well.
So, Alex, this drug-soaked paper, this synthetic cannabinoid, it's called K2 or Tune is what it's being referred to inside prison walls. How deadly is it? What are the effects that you're seeing in people who are incarcerated who don't die? And then what does it take to actually kill someone?
Yeah, some of that is really unknown. There's not necessarily human studies that have been done on these drugs, so we don't know what a lethal dose necessarily is. We do know that the amount that somebody is consuming is quite variable. We hear about these scenarios where you may have multiple people smoking the same product and only one of them dies, and we think that that is related to just how much of the drug they're being exposed to. Certainly for scenarios where someone doesn't die, if they're still in the hospital, they can become very combative. They can sort of go through these psychotic episodes and rages and things that can be not only dangerous to themselves, but to other inmates or to staff. When it relates to death, usually we think that there's some sort of component that's cardiac or related to breathing. We've seen in clinical scenarios that these substances can reduce respiration rate, similar to the kind of the thought behind opioids, where if somebody dies of an opioid overdose, they stop breathing. But this is very different in sort of its mechanism and someone's decreased respiration rate. But there's also issues with increased heart rate and other scenarios, again, that can lead to cardiac failure or cardiac arrest.
For anyone just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about drug overdose deaths inside Ohio prisons and how and why the state is failing to stop those deaths from happening, particularly when it comes to the elaborate drug smuggling system that a year-long investigation has found is in place in Ohio prisons. So, Laura, let me ask you, how deadly is the drug problem in Ohio prisons?
Well, there were 176 deaths in Ohio prisons in 2024. We tracked down, 121 autopsies that were performed, and officials at the Department of Correction had linked like 10 to fatal overdoses, but we did more follow-up and actually found 20, so twice as many as what DRC had documented. And that's probably an undercount because a lot of the coroners are having difficulty finding exactly what chemical compound might have contributed to somebody's death. And oftentimes they'll either put down undetermined or natural causes and attribute it to like an underlying, heart disease or something along those lines. And it's really pretty expensive if you want to go the extra mile to try and find out what exactly was the drug compound that caused the death.
Okay. Laura, one of the inmates that you interviewed was Corey Sutphin. He was an inmate when he was smuggling drugs into Ohio prisons. What kind of drugs was Corey smuggling in, and how did he get caught?
Well, he started out as a driver. A friend of his asked him if he wanted to drive down to Chillicothe from Columbus, and he made in 2 to 2.5 hours of work. He made $1,200, and he was going through an expensive divorce, and he had a drug problem himself, and so he just sort of started working more for this drug smuggling ring. He started doing recon and checking out where was the best places to launch drones. He became a drone operator. He got so good at the drone that he could fly it directly to a cell window where the recipient would just kind of, snatch it right out the window.
Wow.
Kind of like DoorDash. And he said that he made about 100 drops over the course of 7 months. He made about $100,000 in cash, and he was caught largely because one of his co-conspirators was sharing photos and information on recorded lines that are monitored by prison officials. And then also one of the drones crashed at Toledo Correctional. And when the patrol came and picked it up, they pulled out a SIM card, and there was footage of one of Corey's collaborators practicing with the drone, and they were able to. The patrol was able to see a license plate of a neighbor's car, and then just kind of do the investigations. But the investigation was pretty intense, and it took the patrol about maybe 6 months, and they nailed down 11 drops at 5 different prisons.
Okay. If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about drug overdose deaths in prisons and how and why the state has failed to stop drug smuggling from happening inside Ohio prison walls. If you want to be a part of this conversation, the number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. We do have a question in from Todd, who called in and couldn't stay on the line. Doug, I'll ask you to answer this question. Todd asks, have they been able to trace the original sources of the illegal narcotics that have been coming in, and have they been coming from the same origin source?
So there's no good tracking. The corrections officers, when they find drugs during their shift, will report what they found, what they think it is. It's not tested, it's lightly handled, so it's only suspected to be a drug because they don't want to have exposure, incidental exposure. And so that's like a point in time, where they think it came from. 96% of the time, they don't list where it came from. Subsequently, they may investigate and link that drug confiscation back to a source. But only in 4% of the cases are they able to determine on the spot where these drugs are coming from. And through our investigation, we try to understand by talking to current and former incarcerated dealers, as well as officials and workers, how this stuff is getting through. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, the mail route is shut down. They put up taller fencing. They have anti-drone technology. The incarcerated people who are coming back from court visits, appointments, any reason they would have to leave and come back, they're put through an X-ray scanner. The one place where many people told us the drugs are coming through is right through the front door, and that is through workers, whether they're contract workers, privately employed, or state employees, who are the corrections officers and nurses who get to walk through that door every day.
Alex, as someone who is an expert in toxicology, where's this synthetic cannabinoid coming from? Do you have any insight into what the origin source is?
Yeah, it's a little bit complex, and it's really a larger system in terms of synthetic drugs in general. A lot of these, their origin, or at least the precursor chemicals that make these drugs, originate in China and labs overseas. There have been changes to the way that these substances have been synthesized over the years due to bans in China on synthetic cannabinoids. One of the things that has changed more recently, and again, not to relate this to opioids, but I think some of the listeners may be able to kind of connect the dots is that when you have these precursors to fentanyl that are being made overseas and shipped to Mexico to produce fentanyl, we're kind of in the same era now with synthetic cannabinoids where you have precursors of these drugs made overseas. They're shipped to the United States. They can be transformed into their final form and then sprayed onto papers and smuggled into prison. So yes, their origins really do relate back to these sort of really sophisticated labs overseas, but there is some work that's being done here in the United States to transform them into their final usable form.
Now, from Doug and Laura's investigation, there is an interview with Corey Sutphin, the drone operator that Laura was talking about. Let's hear that.
So me personally, I probably made anywhere about 100,000. That was me. And then you think we paid our drivers roughly about $500 a night. Then the other people that were with me doing it, they made about probably almost the same. I blew it just as fast as I made it. Just as fast as I made it, sometimes even faster. I'd go to the bar and drop $1,000 a night just because I knew tomorrow, hey, I'm making it in 4 hours. I'm gonna make it. I had every pair of Jordans you can have. At one point I bought me and all my kids 18 karat gold Cuban chains. But I saw myself as part of the problem. You know, like I was literally flooding multiple prisons throughout the state of Ohio with just the worst of drugs. You know, and it kind of sucks, you know, because everybody expects, oh, no, what you did was cool, what you did was cool. What I did was stupid and foolish.
Let's talk about now how big this business actually is. Corey mentioned there $100,000. I think that was over the course of 7 months for Corey. So, Doug, I'll start by asking you, how easy is it for people who are incarcerated to get drugs right now? I understand there's been a big increase in availability.
Yeah. One of the shocking things we heard is that, and we heard this from the director of ODRC, is that anything you can find on the street, you can find in a prison. Problem is, you're going to pay 20 times as much for it. So that increases the risk, that increases the danger and the violence that comes with that is inherent in a drug business. Now, putting a number on the entire industry, the underground black market for drugs in prison, it's really hard to do because we only know what we can find. We only know what is found. Oftentimes we don't know how it gets in. But we have spoken to several people and we've looked at investigative files where smugglers were making up to $5,000 for a single delivery. So to get a drone over the walls or to walk a package tucked into their lunch box underneath their spaghetti, that's $5,000 for one day's work. And so the incentive and the money that is being made is one of the things that makes it so hard to stop this. And it was kind of demoralizing, but we heard from incarcerated people who were just so pessimistic about doing anything about this just because of the volume of money that's being made.
Mm. Laura, am I understanding this right? Did I see in the reporting that there are actually people who are intentionally becoming incarcerated to be a part of this system?
Yeah, we heard that from multiple people who've spent time inside. They said that there's, people who purposely go to prison to make money. As Doug said, the price of the drugs on the inside is like 20 to 30 times what it would be on the outside. And so there's a huge profit motive. And initially we were kind of like, really people are going to go to prison to become millionaires. But when you consider that one piece of copier paper that the director was holding up is worth, $6,000 on average, and you multiply that by hundreds of pages that are getting smuggled in, and it starts to have some credibility.
So who is involved in this, Doug? So Corey wasn't even in prison at the time. Who has access? What is the system that's developed that's allowing this problem to continue?
So if you're asking about like how the economy works, like how the drugs transact and how the money transacts, it's really sophisticated. So you'll have drugs coming in from visitors, from workers, from drone drops, any way they can get them in. People on the outside are coordinating with people on the inside. So there is an incarcerated dealer who is setting up a person to go pick up the drugs, to have it prepackaged and brought in. Once it's brought in, the people on the outside are letting the folks on the inside know that it's arrived, it's unbundled, and then it's a distribution, just like any other drug ring. The product can be chopped up into bigger pieces, smaller pieces, it can be sold directly to the user, or it can be sold to other incarcerated dealers who then chop it up. And people who are incarcerated, you can't walk around with money. Money is actually something you're not allowed to have in prisons. So money has no value inside the prisons. But what people will do, if they're using, is they'll ask friends or family to send money to, a Venmo or a WhatsApp or a Cash App, some kind of Cash App, to text money to a number. And if you have a son in prison who is desperate for money and he's not telling you exactly why, people will give that money and not ask questions. And we've also heard of people who are trading their commissary, items that you buy through commissary. People are having their commissary stolen, raided. Some people are extorting others for drugs. One of the wilder cases we heard from multiple people, including former officials and current employees, is that people are so desperate to get high that they'll blow a breaker, an electric breaker in the prison, which shuts down the Wi-Fi, and it just drives everybody crazy. And so in order to avoid that disruption in their Wi-Fi service on their electronic tablets, they will allow that person to continue to use for free.
You mentioned that correction officers are involved with this. We have a piece of an interview from your conversation with Barbara Devine. Let's hear that.
Okay, I am Barbara Devine. I'm an inmate at Northeast Rehabilitation Center, and I'm here for possession and conveyance of drugs as a corrections officer. I was contacted on Facebook. Someone had a cell phone in the prison and contacted me on Facebook. He knew everything about my kids. He knew just everything, and he was like, I can also make sure things are taken care of for you in here, because there was a issue with an inmate that had been harassing me and bothering me, and he had that person taken care of. And so I owed him. It was like a form of manipulation. And so I felt like I kind of had to do it anyway. But then the money aspect, that was what really triggered, because I needed the money. I was desperate.
Laura, you talked with another incarcerated person, Steve Grant, and Steve said that until correctional officers care more about their jobs, the smuggling of drugs into prison will not stop. Now, how common is a story like the one we just heard from Barbara?
The department has, we call it like a Hall of Shame poster that they hang in the break room, and it's photos of former vendors or state employees, such as Barbara Devine, who got caught and incarcerated for smuggling. But we think that's just a small portion of them. We found that there's two lists. One is a kind of like a do not rehire list of state employees who are not recommended for rehire into another state job, and there's like 330 people on that one, and then there's about 390 people who are vendors, and they're banned from prison properties. And there's various reasons why you might land on one of those lists, but conveying drugs or contraband into the prisons or having inappropriate relationships with incarcerated people, which often goes hand in hand with smuggling, are two of the reasons. And they're just like of the 104 people on the banned vendor list who were suspected of smuggling contraband, only 30 of them were investigated by the patrol. And so a lot of people, we believe, are just allowed to walk away.
Yeah. And, one of the things we found when we looked at some of the investigative files of former state employees who were busted, prosecuted, convicted, is that they were smuggling for weeks or months before they were caught. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine, the death and chaos that they were delivering for weeks or months. One person said he told investigators he was smuggling for 7 months before he was caught.
Wow. Now, Alex, the former director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, Chambers Smith, said that drug-soaked paper is the most troubling development within state prisons in 30 years. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, certainly the mode in which it's easily transferred around and again, the potency of these substances is quite troubling. And again, there's really no, while papers may be cut up, and you heard the analogy of the M's on the paper, while papers may be cut up into dosage units, what we have found during our analysis is that there actually is quite a wide variety in terms of how much drug is on papers. One piece of the paper, you may get 10 to 20 times more the amount of drug than another piece of paper. So it's, I wouldn't say it's necessarily like Russian roulette, but it is sort of similar in that respect that you really don't know how much substance you're going to be using. And again, these are really difficult things to track, especially once those papers get cut up into smaller pieces. They're so tiny. What we've seen confiscated from jails when they're sitting on the floors or they're sitting in cells. I mean, these are truly little tiny balls of paper at times. It's really difficult to see, to track, to figure out kind of how that's moving around. A sheet of paper is one thing, but again, once it gets divvied up into those dosage units, it becomes a lot more difficult.
And the testing piece of this, Alex, you have significant expertise in this area. Why is this synthetic cannabinoid, K2, or TUN as it's called, why can't it be tested for? Why is it not showing up?
Yeah, well, so it can be tested for. The problem becomes that it really requires specialized testing. These drugs and their chemistry is just different from the other drugs that we deal with in forensic labs. So you need dedicated tests. These substances don't play well with other tests that labs have. So you need kind of new dedicated tests. Because these substances are so potent, they're found at such low levels, which requires really specialized instrumentation, high-powered instrumentation that can give you the level of sensitivity necessary to detect these substances. And then there's a lot of other nuances related to their testing as well. So a lot of labs have just chosen that they're not going to test for these substances. They may seek an external lab like the laboratory I work for to do sort of secondary external testing, but it's something that requires a lot of expertise and resources and funding to be able to do this specialized testing. So that's why a lot of times laboratories either won't test for these substances or it'll be something that's kind of outside of their scope of testing.
Well, I want to thank our panel for the time talking about this today. On the phone, Dr. Alex Krotulski, Director of Toxicology and Chemistry with the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education. Alex, thanks for the time.
Thank you.
Also, Laura Bishop, the Ohio Politics and State Government reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. Laura, thank you.
Hey, thank you.
And here in studio, Doug Livingston, staff writer with the Marshall Project Cleveland. Doug, thanks for the time.
Thank you, Stephanie.
This investigation published yesterday. You can find that on any of those outlets. You'll also find it on the ideastream.org website today. We'll take a quick break now, and when we come back, we'll talk about the concept of prison gerrymandering and why voting rights advocates are pushing to change how people who are incarcerated are counted by the U.S. Census. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Haney. We'll be right back. You're with The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for staying with us. Voting rights experts say people who are incarcerated have been incorrectly represented by their governments for decades through a process called prison gerrymandering. This is a process by which the census counts individuals as residents of correctional facilities rather than their homes prior to incarceration. Research shows this tends to boost the political power of districts that contain prisons, often in rural areas, and decrease the political power of urban communities and communities of color. For the rest of today's show, we'll dive into the issue of prison gerrymandering. This is the next installment in our recurring Law of the Land series, where we look at how laws impact our everyday lives. Joining us by phone, we have Democratic Congress member Emilia Sykes, who represents Ohio's 13th district, which includes Summit County and portions of Stark and Portage counties. Representative Sykes is a co-sponsor of legislation that seeks to end prison gerrymandering. Thanks for calling in, Representative.
Thank you.
Also by phone, we have an expert on voting and redistricting, Kareem Creighton. He's the vice president for the Washington, D.C. office of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. Thanks so much for calling in.
Delighted to be with you.
If you want to be a part of this conversation, you can give us a call. That number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or message us on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Kareem, can you explain the problem with the census counting people as living at their correctional facilities rather than at their prior homes?
Sure. Well, as you know, every 10 years, the census tries to take an account of the people who live in the United States. In its assessment, often they take a snapshot, and that snapshot inevitably captures people where they happen to be at the time that the surveys are made. That includes people who are in prison and the various state facilities around the country. There are about 1.1 million people across the country who fall into that category. The challenge is that when those districts get crafted, those districts are crafted to last for 10 years. What we also know is that people who are in state prison, on average, are only in prison for 3 years. So if you take that snapshot and isolate them in that place where they happen to be at the time the census is taken, what you're missing is, for more than a majority of that decade, the fact that those people are likely to be in their locations where they are from. And what we know is most people who are in prisons are about 100 miles or so away from where they happen to live. What are the effects of that? It means that districts that happen to be located where these people are from are undercounted, whereas places where they happen to be incarcerated for a short period of time on average happen to get overrepresentation. And that has impact in who gets represented and how much power they get to wield in state government.
Congressmember Sykes, can you tell us about the census count and how this plays into the way we draw our maps in Ohio and why the place where people are counted when they're incarcerated matters?
Sure. And I think Kareem for laying the foundation for why this is a problem, but I'll take another step back as well, because the census count also determines allocation of federal resources to communities. And so if they're being counted in areas that they are only residing in temporarily because of their incarceration and plan to, as most folks who are inmates do, go back to their home counties or home cities, that means also in terms of federal dollars and resources, they're being shortchanged as well. But even beyond that part, the representation section of your question, a portion of your question, begs the question is, are these representatives going into these correctional facilities and hearing out the concerns of their constituents and then bringing them back to their legislative bodies? And pretty consistently, the answer is no. And in addition to the fact that it dilutes and distorts, as has been mentioned, the ability for these areas where these individuals resided in the first place, knowing that they will likely return. And so overall, this is an issue of adequate representation and ensuring that we are counting people where they are, which I know the census is supposed to do, but it does not take into account the fact that, as Kareem mentioned, people will eventually get out. It will most likely return to their homes where they were prior to, and those homes are going to be underfunded because of the census count and underrepresented as well. And that becomes an issue on adequate representation and ensuring that people, no matter who they are, have ability to lobby and advocate for themselves in their community.
It does raise an interesting question about the census in general happening every 10 years. You know, a lot has changed over time. People are much more mobile than they used to be. Of course, that's a completely separate issue than what we're talking about today. Now, Kareem, let me ask you, in your looking into this type of issue, do people in prisons and jails feel unrepresented through this system of drawing maps?
Well, I think you can look at a lot of feedback that you see both in individual interviews and certainly in terms of the aggregate studies about what the interests are of people who happen to be incarcerated for a period of time. If you look at the conditions of prisons, often the people who are bringing those claims are organizations that are suing on behalf of people who are in prison. They are not often getting the support of the people who represent the areas where those prisons are located. And so that becomes a pretty significant challenge. And, as the representative said, often the interests of the people who are in those facilities are often being voiced by the people who happen to be their family members and community colleagues who are in their homes, in their home counties. And it's important to note that that is not just random. A lot of urban areas in states like Ohio are the people or the locations that donate, if you will, representative power to more rural parts of the state. And often there's an interest, political or otherwise, in trying to maintain that over representation. And so it has impact, and the greatest impact, I think, is on the people who don't have their interest represented in prisons. They cannot vote in most of the states in this country when they're in prison, and therefore don't have the ability directly to get the appeal of the people who represent the areas where those facilities are located. And that actually highlights the other lack of reason in having a policy that doesn't fairly allocate people based on where they live as opposed to where they happen to be imprisoned.
If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about a concept called prison gerrymandering, and this refers to the process by which people who are incarcerated are counted in the U.S. Census at the place where they are incarcerated rather than their previous home of record. If you want to be a part of this conversation, the number to call is 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org. Today, we're talking with an expert on voting and redistricting, Kareem Creighton. He is with the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. Also, U.S. Representative for Ohio's 13th District, Democrat Amelia Sykes. Now, Representative Sykes, you and fellow representatives in Congress introduced the End Prison Gerrymandering Act, and that would change a bit about this process. The sponsors of this bill are arguing that prison gerrymandering gives undue power to certain regions of the country. Kareem was starting to talk about this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And it is an overrepresentation for certain communities, rural communities where these prisons are often located. They need the land, they need the space. And so that is why they're often located there. But at the same time, when you are adding that snapshot, tens of thousands of people who don't have roots there, who don't plan to stay there, it is inflating and distorting the amount of people in the population while underrepresenting the people in typically larger urban communities when those folks come back. Now, I mentioned earlier, in addition to the gerrymandering part, the census is how the federal government calculates and tabulates these formulas around resources into these communities. And knowing that these large urban communities have more people, where many of the societal ills that we are tackling, from addiction to violence, are more impactful in these areas, and they're also losing resources, and it just continues to perpetuate a cycle where people cannot escape the cycle of poverty or violence or incarceration because they're also being under-resourced by the funds, the tax dollars that are being spent in these communities are going to these rural areas. But the other part I would add about this is state legislatures generally across the country, but particularly in Ohio, have complete control over the redistricting process. Now, why is that an issue? Well, you think about the speakers of the House and the Senate presidents over the last decade. It's going to take you some time to find one of those individuals from a large urban area. For example, the last time there was a Speaker of the House from a large urban area was Armond Budish from Cuyahoga County. That was in 2008 or 2010. And then even the last Democratic Speaker of the House, Vern Rice, was from southeastern Ohio, Rural County. And so these individuals are making the decisions. And of course, if they're being good representatives to their areas, they're going to advantage their communities. And so when you think about who is and who are the people who are best positioned to direct resources and make decisions, when your leadership if these legislative bodies come from rural areas, they're going to take advantage of that, and they have. And they have consistently done that. And as my time in the state legislature, we saw oftentimes some of these legislators were hostile to urban communities. Even just looking at the decision to allocate SNAP benefits after the changing of the One Big Beautiful Bill, that impacted negatively urban counties. You think about the same thing with the Rural Health Care Fund that is happening from the One Big Beautiful Bill, impacting large urban counties negatively, even though they're providing the services. And so this cycle just continues and perpetuates to disadvantage large communities. And also, let's not forget that these larger areas are contributing more to the tax base, to the state governments, to the federal governments, because that's where the people are, that's where the economic engines are, but then they're being shortchanged on their representation.
Kareem, what do you think about that? Is there a concern that prison gerrymandering is being used as a way to help gerrymander state maps to favor a certain political party?
Well, this is actually one of the big, I think, advancements in this report that we just issued. Our research associate, Arlis Herzig, spent a lot of time trying to estimate what the actual numerical impact would be. And if you look at places, like the representative said, in the more urban counties in the state of Ohio, but not just Ohio. This study looked at 11 states, but in Ohio especially, there were 2 additional districts in the House that the county where Columbus is located would have gotten additional representation under a system that fairly allocated people based on where they were from as opposed to where they were housed in prison. And, we're on the march, I think, in some ways of seeing states recognize this and some decide to move in the direction of fairly allocating. About 19 states have moved in that direction, but as the representative stated, there are a lot of states, unfortunately Ohio's one of them, that are locked into not doing that. And federal legislation may be one way to push back against it, but it definitely has impact, and it has significance for a lot of the people who, again, are in many ways looking for answers not just from the federal government but from state government, but where gerrymandering is locked in, and we have a history with dealing with Ohio and its gerrymander. These policies are stuck absent some movement that sometimes can come from the federal government to unlock it.
Mm. We have a hypothetical question now in from a listener. Now, we do know that we learned from Kareem that the average amount of time a person is spending incarcerated is about 3 years, not 10 years, but averages work in a way. There are people below that number and higher than that number. So our listener asks, why shouldn't the correctional institution address be used as the address for someone who's incarcerated if they're sentenced for 10 years or more? Representative Sykes, what do you say to that?
That is an option, and it could be taken into account, and it's something that we could look at, but it's not. I think that is a fair question and a perhaps fair allocation if that person is there. But ultimately, one of the things that we have recognized is the point of incarceration in prisons is for corrections and ultimately for that person to go back home. And when we think about representation, these folks are not necessarily choosing to be incarcerated. This is an action of the government. They violated the law and they have been removed from their home in order to be and to have corrective activities and rehabilitation abilities for when they return back to their homes. And then again, going back to the previous comments, the resources are not being allocated there because they're going back to these communities, and they're not then being released to those communities where those resources and those dollars are following them. And so I think it is a fair question. It could be something that we could look into. However, it is either an all or none, and unfortunately, so much of our politics is all or nothing, and there are very little opportunities to negotiate things that could be logical and reasonable.
Now, the census doesn't have to be used in this way. Kareem, without this legislation that has been proposed by the representative, there are states that have passed legislation to end prison gerrymandering at the state level, like New York, for example, coming up with non-legislative solutions to count incarcerated people at their homes of record rather than the place where they are currently in custody, like Pennsylvania, rather than using census data. So is this something that could happen on a state-by-state basis?
In fact, yes, and it already is, to your point. A lot of states have recognized that this is a real problem for the cause of fair representation, and either through legislation or sometimes when commissions draw maps, The commission has adopted a policy to say we're going to make sure that people are tracked based on where they live, not necessarily where they're housed at the moment. And I'd also like to just note, it's not as though this is the only population where this issue comes up, and the law has been quite forgiving of these instances. Just to give you three examples, during the census, there are people who might be stationed abroad in the military, they might be in the foreign service, or they might be on a religious mission, all of which might take them not just out of the state, but out of the country. And in those cases, the law often tries to take account of those populations to show some level of fairness both to the state and to the people. And so this is, I think, one of the other ways in which you might say that fair districting would respect not just sort of the community, because of course these communities that are deprived of representation have all of the consequences that have been described. But if we're serious, and I think it's a bipartisan issue about second chances, we want to show regard for the fact that people are going to emerge from prison with a changed approach in life to try to pursue jobs and hopefully exercise all the tools of citizenship, which would include both voting and seeking representation from the people who are elected.
Representative Sykes, this is federal legislation that you've proposed. Why do you think it's important that this happen on a federal level?
Well, we just heard from Kareem, there's a piecemeal by piecemeal, state by state, and different state actors or commissions do this. But if we're thinking of the one person, one vote standard that we have for federal elections, it would make sense for this to adhere, this policy to adhere across the country. Essentially, it's setting up situations where some people in this country are being fully represented while others are not. Again, I keep going back to the funding part because that also is a segment and a piece of representation, the resources, your tax dollars going back to the communities in which you've spent them and used them and where you will live and maybe grow or thrive. And that's not happening either. They're going to other areas and disproportionately being spent in communities where they should be elsewhere. And so it would be my hope that this could happen across the country so we could certainly and absolutely adhere to the one person, one vote doctrine that we are supposed to. And just because you live in one state or the other, you're not disenfranchised, or a community or a region or a state is not being disenfranchised because the state legislature, also due to gerrymandering efforts, are not making sure that everyone is represented appropriately.
Now, Kareem mentioned that he believes this is very likely a bipartisan issue. Do you think it's a bipartisan issue that everyone should care about, since we are in a situation where every district does have people in a prison or jail that might be counted in a different district than their home of record?
It absolutely should be, but it's not. And one thing that I have noticed is people are, and many of my colleagues in state legislatures, as in Congress where I am now, are attempting to keep power at all costs, even unearned majorities. It does not matter the representation. It is more about who controls the process and who controls the dollars, who controls the influence in these legislative bodies in these states and in the country. And so unfortunately, there are many actors who care less about the constituents they serve or people, but more concerned about their power. And that is where we are starting to see, and that is where we get this corruption in government that is not responsive to the people. And while some folks might be listening and thinking, why should I be sympathetic to an individual who has broken the law and who has found themselves in prison, this is not about that individual. This is about how the system works together in order to make sure that people are represented or not represented well. And it is no doubt, and I can say this from my experience both in the state legislative and congressional bodies, that there is a hostile response sometimes to larger communities, but the representation is not the same, and it's an oversized way in which it is carrying out in its implementation. And so if you are a person who believes in fairness, that things should be distributed equally based on merit, based on the numbers or majority rules, then you would believe in this. But unfortunately, power tends to prevail over people and what is right and fair and representative. And unfortunately, I have not found many Republicans who are willing to do this in my tenure. Nonetheless, I think that folks should be a lot more mindful. And as Kareem mentioned, there are exceptions for other individuals But I don't think that we can lose sight of the fact that most of the time when people are incarcerated, they are from poor communities, communities of color, and those are groups who are typically underrepresented and disenfranchised in many of these processes.
That's all the time we have for today in this conversation about prison gerrymandering in light of the reintroduction of the End Prison Gerrymandering Act. I want to thank Congressmember Amelia Sykes, who represents Ohio's 13th District, for calling in. Thank you very much, Representative.
Thanks for having me.
And also Kareem Creighton with the Brennan Center for Justice. Thank you for your time today, Kareem.
Delighted. Thank you.
That'll wrap up the show for today. If you missed any part of today's show, you can listen to the Sound of Ideas podcast or watch the show on the IdeaStream Public Media YouTube page. You can also hear our rebroadcast tonight at 9 on 89.7 WKSU. To get the last word on today's topics, you can email us at soi@ideastream.org or find us on Instagram, send us a message, or leave a comment at The Sound of Ideas. We had a lot of engagement on Thursday's show on The Rage Project from photographer Christina Ramirez, which creates a space for people who are assigned female at birth to express their anger in a safe and supportive space and document that on camera. Caitlin wrote in, I am very lucky to know and love Christina and many of the very brave participants of the Rage Project. I have yet to participate personally, but have followed the project from the first second and have learned so much watching my friends and colleagues share this part of themselves. I am so thankful this kind of voice is being not only encouraged, but celebrated. It is so necessary, especially right now. I am also a crier and am weeping at my desk listening. So proud. Thank you very much for sharing that thought, Caitlin. We hope you had some tissues close by on Thursday morning. Now, tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas, we'll talk to Northeast Ohioans who have connections to the U.S.-Israel war in Iran. And we'll also talk with a tax expert about some of the changes to your filing of your taxes this year as the filing deadline nears. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for keeping the conversation going. We'll see you back here tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas.